Good afternoon, and welcome to the Concord Bookshop. This is a very, very good crowd we have here, and we're glad that you all could come. If you grew up in Massachusetts, like I did, you learn three things very quickly. Despite its spelling, Worcester has no R's in it, is the first. The second is there are very, very few Republicans, but if you are a Republican, you have a pretty good shot at being elected governor. And third, your senator is always named Kennedy. A group of distinguished reporters from the Boston Globe put together today's book, The Last Lion, The Fall and Rise of Ted Kennedy. We're fortunate to have two of these reporters with us. Bella English is a family reporter for the Boston Globe Living Arts section. Her beat covers families and the important issues affecting the lives of today's children. In addition to her beat, she writes a family travel column on the second Sunday of each month. Donna Coyne.
No. I used to.
I used to. Okay, sorry.
My kids grew up.
Sorry, I got it out of the biography from the Globe. Okay, Don. Here it says you write for the Boston Living and Arts section, which I know you do. His beat covers personality profiles, issue pieces, trend stories, and human interest stories, including those of unsung heroes. He joined the Globe in 1986 as a copy editor and became a reporter in 1991. He's covered television, Boston City Hall, and was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bella English and Donna Coyne. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just want to make a couple of brief opening remarks to give you a sense of how this book came into being. When Senator Kennedy was stricken with a seizure last May, later diagnosed, as you know, as brain cancer, it threw into very sharp relief the life of a man who's loomed very large in the political landscape in this state and in this country for half a century, but whose story has largely been told through a partisan lens. Because even more than George W. Bush, even more than Bill or Hillary Clinton, Ted Kennedy has always had the ability to polarize people. People who love Ted Kennedy really love him, and people who hate Ted Kennedy really hate him. People on both sides have written books. What we decided to do at the Globe, prompted by the emotional national outpouring at news of Senator Kennedy's diagnosis, was to try to move beyond the caricatures of saint or sinner. Try to take the long view, try to see the man whole. The Globe seemed a logical institution to attempt this 360-degree portrait because our newspaper has covered Ted Kennedy very closely since he was first elected in 1962. Over the past 47 years, the Globe has devoted millions, possibly billions of words to covering this man. We decided to devote another 250,000 words to really doing a full portrait of him. So beginning late June, early July, 7 Globe reporters were launched, and we did hundreds of interviews, including interviews with some of his relatives, longtime friends, longtime adversaries, aides, and average people who had come into contact with the senator over time. What some of us came to believe in the course of researching, reporting, and writing this book was that though Kennedy was for a long time seen as the least illustrious of the three brothers, he may actually be remembered by history as more consequential in some ways than either Jack or Bobby. And we recognize that's a debatable proposition, but what is not debatable, we think, is that this complicated, contradictory man has led a complicated, contradictory, mind-bendingly eventful, and utterly extraordinary life and career. And that's what we tried to capture with Last Lion, The Fall and Rise of Ted Kennedy, which I'm happy to report in today's, you reached casually for a prep, today's New York Times is number 7 on the bestseller list. That was a nice thing to wake up to. Anyway, we'd like to read a few sections of this book for you today, and for that I will turn it over to my colleague, Bella English.
We divided this up chronologically, and Don and I are sort of bookends. I have the first 28 years of the senator's life, and Don has the last part of his life. So we're probably going to switch back and forth, but just bear with us. So I have the childhood, Teddy's Harvard years, his Army years, his Harvard years again, UVA Law School, meeting Joan, getting married, and the 1958 and 60 campaigns for his brother. So I'm just well, I should say that the thing that surprised me the most when I was researching this, I spent a lot of time in the JFK library last summer reading journals and letters and telegrams. I don't think the Kennedys threw anything away. And I sort of concluded at the end of my research that Ted, despite all these wonderful Hyannisport pictures you'd see of the family playing football down the lawn and the sailing on Nantucket Sound, that he really was a lonely child. You know, a lot of times Rose and Joe were not in residence, and they traveled a lot and usually not together. The kids were all off in boarding schools often, and I think he was in 10 different schools in 11 years, and Ted is not ever one to complain. He was sort of the eternal optimist of the family. I think he got a lot of that from his grandfather, Honey Fitz. But even he said that was hard to take. He was always the new kid, and he was never really able to put down roots. His parents also were tough. I mean, yes, they gave their children all the privileges in the world, but there was a price to pay, and the price was you had to live up to very high standards. And that was really Rose's way, at least, of showing her love. She set these almost obsessively difficult standards for grades, of course for going to church, and I'm going to read you just some of her letters. Well, this is self-explanatory. Rose, a devout Catholic, would not use birth control, and by the time she became pregnant with Teddy at 41, friends felt she was crazy to have another child. She was too old. She already had 8. She'd be worn out. Worse, for the fashion-conscious Rose, her figure would be ruined. I became so incensed and so annoyed at being constantly berated that I determined secretly that no one was going to feel sorry for me or my baby. And so perhaps that is why Ted is so full of optimism and confidence, she wrote in her journal. Decades later, she would add a postscript. I have often thought in later years how right I was in trusting God's wisdom and love, because if I did not have Teddy now, I would have no son. From the moment of his birth, Teddy had a unique vantage point on an extraordinary family. He was swept up in the embrace of 8 siblings. Shortly before he was born, big brother Jack, who went to the exclusive boarding school Choate, had written his mother, "It is the night before exam, so I will write you Wednesday. Lots of love, Jack. P.S. Can I be godfather to the baby?" And so a month later, 14-year-old Jack stood up at the christening with Cardinal Cushing officiating. Rosemary, the oldest girl, was godmother. From the start, Teddy was the adored baby brother. When he was just a month old, Kathleen, the second oldest daughter, wrote her father, "Everyone is crazy about Ted." So, Ted was the youngest of 9, the 4th of 4 brothers, and as the baby, his role in the family, which you quickly learned, was to be sort of the jester, you know, to be the entertainer, to be the one that, the joy, the light of the family, and he was very good at that. But he was also the victim of low expectations. Following 3 brilliant older brothers was tough, and he never was quite able to live up to the expectations. All right. Weight was a Kennedy family obsession, with the parents and their children often fretting in letters about their own, and especially about that of the husky youngest Kennedy. When Teddy was going to play center on the Fessenden football team, his father wrote Jack, "I am still waiting to take a look at that one myself. He is too fat." Back when Teddy was 7 years old, his sister Eunice had reported to her father, "Teddy is getting bigger, better, and fatter. While he weighs 89, is only 15 pounds overweight. In fact, he looks like 2 boys instead of 1. Rose sent a telegram to her husband in 1940 when Teddy was 8. "Thinking of you. Teddy a little fatter. I am a little thinner." A few months later, she wrote again, "Teddy is really such a fatty." Joe once ended a letter to a lonely Teddy who had complained about not getting enough to eat at school on this sardonic note. "I'm sorry to see that you were starving to death. I can't imagine that ever happening to you if there was anything at all to eat around, but then you can spare a few pounds." But it was the boy's grades that most perturbed his parents. Rose didn't just write Teddy, chiding him about being in the 3rd, 5th of his class. She also wrote the headmaster at Pheasanton to complain about his spelling and math. Although I do not want him to lose the spontaneous quality of his letters, I do think he should practice the words he frequently misspells. She enclosed a word list for his teacher and sent such lists along every couple of weeks. The following summer, when Ted was 11, she wrote the headmaster again, this time about numbers. My only complaint about his work is that he still counts on his fingers. Will you please bring it to the attention of his arithmetic teacher in the fall? Joe, whose own grades had been mediocre, could be merciless too. He wrote Teddy, "You still spell no, K-N-O-W. Skating is not S-C-A-T-I-N-G," and so on. He didn't limit his critiques of Teddy merely to Teddy. He shared them with others. There are to be few secrets in the Kennedy family, at least not among parents and children. As Joe breezily reported to the others, Teddy is the same as ever, quite self-sufficient and probably the worst speller Pheasanton had ever seen. Perhaps the toughest parental scolding was that which compared the siblings with one another. Joe wrote the 11-year-old Teddy, "You didn't pass in English or geography, and you only got 60 in spelling and history. That is terrible. You wouldn't want to have people say that Joe Jr. and Jack Kennedy's brother was such a bad student, so get on your toes." Comparisons among the Kennedy brothers began at an early age for Ted, and would become a lifelong challenge for him. Joe Jr. had been the charming, ambitious brother. Jack was the reflective intellectual. Bobby was serious and dogged. Teddy was the entertainer and more into sports and grades. And I go on to say that his parents, Joan Rose, defined their jobs much like partners in a franchise, and their product as national leaders who would vastly expand the Kennedy name.
Okay. Flash forward to Ted at age 36, 1969, thrust into the role of family patriarch after the assassination of Bobby, which of course followed 5 years after the murder of Jack. Bobby had been the first to step up to the task. After Jack was assassinated in 1963, Bobby sought to rally the family's spirits and strengthen their bonds by rounding up the clan for annual whitewater rafting expeditions in the western United States. It worked, at least for the young Kennedys. They found the daredevil dynamism of RFK, daddy to his own kids, Uncle Bobby to the rest, captivating as he led them down the biggest rivers and through the fiercest rapids. As always with the Kennedys, a spirit of competition bordering on combat reigned. From their side-by-side rafts, the adults and the kids waged exuberant water fights all the way down the river. The Kennedys had always felt most like a family when they were breaking a sweat. Whether it was touch football, tennis, or skiing, tackling a physical challenge somehow made the other challenges seem manageable. But after Bobby's assassination, the family learned that overcoming the death of their leader was a much harder task than conquering any river. It fell to Ted to try to recapture the old solidarity. So in the summer of 1969, with the wounds from Bobby's loss still raw, Ted organized another rafting trip, this time to Utah's Green River. By gathering the family again, he hoped, in the words of Christopher Kennedy Lawford, the son of Patricia Kennedy and Peter Lawford, to prove that despite Dallas and Los Angeles, the family would go on. But the trip was a disaster. The adults were mired in grief and gloom. They floated along with their daiquiris and poulet foussé and didn't want to be bothered. Did I pronounce that right, by the way? Thank you. I knew in Concord I'd get a lot of You would know. They were angry and not in the mood to indulge the hijinks of the younger generation. So grim was the mood that when the youngsters tried to rekindle tradition of a water fight, the adults refused to join in and demanded that they stop. And when the kids kept it up, the irritated grown-ups sent a guide to make their point by forcefully tossing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and David Kennedy into the river. The glory and happiness of the early days were gone, Lawford recalled of the trip. Uncle Teddy was left to pick up the pieces and be harshly judged for his humanity. The older generation was wounded badly, and their wounds were showing. Most ominous for Ted's future as family leader, the mistrust and estrangement from our parents' generation was solidified, hard and fast, said Lawford. In the years that followed, the next generation of Kennedys would challenge their Uncle Teddy in ways he had never been challenged, with everything from drug addiction and car accidents to charges of rape. They would add incalculably to the weight upon his shoulders, and they, along with his sick son and wife, would factor into his decisions not to run for president. Ted was an imperfect role model, to be sure. The older children, advancing through adolescence in the turbulent 1970s, understood his stature in government, but they also knew about Chappaquiddick and his reputation for partying as hard as he worked. By nature, he was comfortable providing the needed love, but he was less well prepared to cover for the loss of a father's discipline. Still, the senator threw himself into the task of surrogate dad. Somehow re-engineering his hectic work schedule, he made sure to be present at first communions, confirmations, and graduations. He showed up for dinner every week or two with Ethel Kennedy's brood, asked the children about their grades in school, and gently but firmly requested explanations for their C's or D's. Somewhat ironic in light of what Bella read earlier. He never failed to call them on their birthdays. It was Ted who took Joe II, Bobby's eldest son, on a trip to Spain in '68, away from reminders of his father's murder. But as hard as he tried to fill the void, he could not erase the pain of a lost father. He could not take away the memory of violence, seared into the children's psyches, or shade them from the spotlight it would train on them for life. As the consequences of their shared history grew clearer, many of Ted's nephews ran wild, caught up in what Lawford, speaking of himself, but in words that also applied to several of his cousins, described as a relentless quest for girls, drugs, and trouble.
Ted was a really devoted son, and when Rose finally died at the age of 105 or something like that, four, he went to Mass every single day for a year. And as I said, she wasn't an easy mother. I'm going to just read a little bit more about Rose, then we're going to go into another woman in his life, Joan. Rose was obsessed with learning. She would pin clippings from newspapers and magazines onto a bulletin board so the children could bone up on the news of the day and comment on it at the table. Like her father before her, Rose became famous for her field trips, in which she'd bundle everyone, including cousins, into the car and take them to Massachusetts historic sites such as Bunker Hill, the Old North Church, and Plymouth Rock. At Walden Pond, the kids didn't just swim and picnic, they also got a lesson on Thoreau. She never stopped her quest for perfection. When Bobby was a teenager, she wrote him about a particularly bad report card saying that he owed it to himself and to her to improve. Remember, too, that it is a reflection on my brains as the boys in the family are supposed to get their intellect from their mother. And certainly I do not expect my own little pet to let me down. Much later, after Teddy became a senator, Rose would write to chide him about his grammar. I wish you would pay attention to this matter. Use whom after a preposition. For whom the bell tolls, the man to whom I wrote. If you listen to Jack's speeches, you will notice that he always uses this word correctly. It is the accusative case in Latin, objective case in English. In 1972, when Teddy was 40 years old, she scolded him about his language. I noticed you're quoted as using the word ass in several expressions. I do not think you should use that word. I am sure you realize it really does not look very well in print. Still later, when Ted was a third-term senator and Rose was 85, she wrote to him, I watched you speak about drugs last Friday night. Please say if I were president, not if I was president. The reason is the old, what used to be known in Latin as condition contrary to fact. For instance, if I were he, etc. But Teddy rarely recalled her remonstrations, probably believing it was her way of showing her love. This is just, I'm going to read this just because I love this scene. This is so priceless. Teddy, of course, was thrown out of Harvard for cheating on his Spanish exam. He had a football teammate take it for him, and both boys were thrown out of school. And so for 2 years he enlisted in the Army and was sent to Paris because Joe had already lost one son in the war and almost lost a second son in the war, and he wasn't about to send his youngest off to Korea. So Teddy ended up at a NATO, like a palace, somewhere outside of Paris, a NATO honor guard. And Paris, of course, was Rose's favorite city. In Paris, Rose loved shopping for the latest designer fashions and made her pilgrimage to the Ritz several times during Teddy's years in France. During one visit, she offered to take him out to dinner. Teddy was looking forward to a feast, a delicious prospect for a young private who had been living on mess hall food for what seemed like an eternity, he said. But as they were preparing to leave the Ritz, Rose couldn't find her jewelry. She had never trusted the safe deposit boxes at hotels, and so she would hide her baubles in various corners of the room. On this particular night, however, she'd forgotten where she'd hidden the jewels. Fearing that they had been stolen, she refused to leave the room until they were located. She and Teddy spent an hour looking. Quote, "At long last, from missing our dinner reservation, we found the jewelry pinned into the line of the drapery," he recalled some years later, where Rose had pinned it. "I did not have my gourmet dinner, but ordering room service with mother was still a marvelous treat." The next day, his mother gave him a ride to his post, and Teddy said goodbye outside the gate. He didn't want his army buddies seeing the limo she had hired. But as he was walking back inside, he heard Rose call, "Teddy, Teddy, you forgot your dancing shoes." His friends teased him about it for months, and his mother never tired of hearing the story even years later. We're going to skip over to Joan. Rose and Joe soon decided it was time for Teddy to settle down. There had been some police high-speed chases at the University of Virginia, where he was in law school, and they wanted him to follow Bobby's example of getting married sooner rather than Jack's example of getting married later. So the whole family went down to Manhattanville College. They were going to dedicate a gym to Kick, who had been killed in the war, Kathleen's older sister. And Ted was actually making the dedication speech himself. All the Kennedy women had gone to Manhattanville. So Joan Bennett almost missed that meeting because she stayed in her room to do some homework, and she didn't want to be bothered. But then her roommate came back and said, "You got to come, the nuns are going to get mad." So she got dressed and went over, and that's when she was introduced to Teddy by his sister Jean. Okay, and then Ted asked her to down to New York for lunch. The weekend visit to New York with Pat along to chaperone went well enough that Rose invited Joan to Hyannisport, where so many Kennedy dates had been vetted. It was just the three of them, Ted, Joan, and Rose, and they ate every meal together each day. Joan, a gifted pianist, played for Rose, and Rose played some too. Rose, Joan thought, approved of her. Quote, "I think she was thrilled that her son liked a nice Catholic Manhattanville girl." Over the winter, the couple went skiing with others, never spending a night alone. "You know, in the 1950s, girls didn't go anywhere without a chaperone," Joan says. In those days, it was much more formal. She and Ted were allowed little more than chaste kisses until their wedding night. Joan spent a weekend at Charlottesville and visited Ted at law school, and then Ted went up to the Bennett vacation home in New Hampshire. In late summer, Ted proposed to her on the beach at Hyannisport, awkwardly mumbling, "What do you think about our getting married?" He also asked Joan's father, Harry Bennett, a wealthy advertising executive, for her hand in marriage. Tongue-in-cheek, Bennett replied, "Can you support my daughter in the manner to which she is accustomed?" Joe Kennedy asked Joan a question too. "Do you love my son?" But the truth was, the couple really didn't know each other very well. They had never discussed politics, the Kennedy family's great ambition. In fact, Joan says, there were really no deep talks at all. Rose, from the Ritz in Paris, wrote a nice note upon hearing their news, but she got Joan's name wrong. "Dearest Connie," she wrote, "how delighted I was to hear on the phone yesterday the wonderful news about your engagement to Teddy. I had hoped he would win you from the moment I first met you at the Cape." Joan would later reason that her mother-in-law mistakenly wrote Connie because she was thinking of actress Constance Bennett, who had a sister named Joan. Constance Bennett, in fact, had married the ex-husband of actress Gloria Swanson, with whom Joe Kennedy had a long affair. If Joan thought that life as Rose's daughter-in-law would be easy, the mistaken name on the letter might have been good reason not to make that assumption. As the wedding date approached, Joan told her father she was a bit nervous about it all. Harry Bennett spoke to Joe about delaying the wedding, but Joe was adamant the wedding would go on. Ted and Joan were married November 29, 1958, by Cardinal Spellman at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church in Bronxville. Jack, the best man, wore a microphone because the Bennetts had hired a film crew to make a movie of the wedding. Later, watching the film, Joan would hear Jack whisper to his nervous brother that marriage didn't mean you had to be faithful. It was not the gift her father had planned, but it did serve as an early warning. Like his father and Jack, Teddy would never bother living up to the fidelity part of the oath. During the reception, Rose found Ted and his two brothers watching the Army-Navy football game and hurried them back to the party.
Okay. Fast forward again to 9/11, which we all remember all too well. By remarkable coincidence, well, I'll read it. On September 11, 2001, Ted was in his office, awaiting a visit from First Lady Laura Bush, when he spotted something on the TV set. "That can't be a mistake," he said grimly. It was shortly before 9 a.m., and he was standing stock still in his outer office. A TV on the desk of his chief of staff, Mary Beth Cahill, had just shown a plane crashing into the World Trade Center in New York City. Ted, who had spent much of his life in the air, sensed immediately that it was no accident. But the magnitude of the crisis was not yet known, and Mrs. Bush was slated to arrive at his office at that very moment. They had scheduled a meeting that morning because the First Lady was going to testify later in the day on education issues before a committee that Ted chaired. Mrs. Bush walked into the office. She'd heard about the plane, but, like Ted, did not yet know that it was part of a terrorist attack. The two of them went to his private office and began to talk. Then the second plane hit. Gail hastily scribbled a note, got up from her desk, and hurried into the senator's office. She handed Ted the note. He told Mrs. Bush what had happened. The two of them hastened to the outer office and stood with their eyes glued to the TV coverage until the Secret Service agents hustled Mrs. Bush away to a secure location. Ted accompanied the First Lady until she was off the Capitol grounds. She was his guest, and he felt a responsibility for her safety. Then he turned back towards his office. There would be a lot of work to be done, the kind of private and public comforting that Ted had long since mastered in the days ahead. I'd like to read you a short piece that reflects that kind of public comforting. I read you an excerpt earlier that showed Ted sort of falteringly stepping into the role of family patriarch, a role he has acquitted quite remarkably well. There's another dimension of that has to do with a kind of public patriarch, and here is some of that. When Cindy McGinty of Foxborough, Massachusetts, heard the booming voice on the other end of the telephone line, so instantly recognizable with its impossibly broad vowels, she wondered who had chosen the worst possible time to play a prank on her. That couldn't really be Ted Kennedy, could it? It was September 12th, 2001. One day earlier, McGinty's husband, Mike, had been killed in the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history. Cindy McGinty had lost her husband, and her two sons, 7 and 8, had lost their father. I was totally grief-stricken, scared out of my mind, recalls McGinty. But now Ted Kennedy, for it was indeed he, was on the line, calling to share her grief. Ted told McGinty how sorry he was for her loss, and said that his family and the entire nation shared that sorrow. He asked if there was any way he could be helpful, and told McGinty that if there were anything she needed, anything at all, then or in the future, she should contact his office. There was nothing rote about Kennedy's words, no sense that he was hurrying through a list. He spoke like a man who knew, insofar as any other human being could possibly know, what she was going through. McGinty was grateful but a bit stunned to hear from such a famous figure. Yet the reality was that for all his fame, Ted prided himself on his personal connection to his constituents, the incarnation of the old-school ethos he absorbed from his grandfather, Honey Fitz. His standing instructions to Barbara Suliotis, chief of staff in his Boston office, were to respond to every one of the 300 letters the office received each week, and to every one of the hundreds of phone calls as well. I know what gets me elected, he would say to Suliotis, but he and she knew there was more to it than that. The Kennedy name would have been enough to get him reelected every 6 years. Yet tens of thousands of Massachusetts residents have personal memories of Kennedy's interventions on their behalf on matters large and small. And that's what he did after 9/11. In the month following the attacks, Kennedy called each of the 177 families in Massachusetts who lost loved ones on that day. One of them was Sally White, who describes herself as a, quote, dyed-in-the-wool conservative Republican, and whose daughter, Susan Blair, died on 9/11. The last person whose voice she expected to hear on her answering machine was that of the quintessential liberal Democrat. I'd not heard from one local politician, one medium politician, or certainly any federal guy, nothing, says White. He was the first one to call and offer assistance, or even sympathy. When she called him back, Ted framed his comforting words to White in the most personal of terms. He told her that his family's experience of loss had well acquainted him with the pain it causes. And he talked about the time he'd spent with Caroline Kennedy after John F. Kennedy was killed. John F. Kennedy Jr. was killed in a plane crash. He asked the grieving mother about her daughter Susan, what she'd been like. He was very interested and very sincere, recalls White. He talked to me like he was my next-door neighbor, my best friend. He had all the time in the world for me. I was totally blown away. I was just overwhelmed by a person of his stature reaching out to me. He did it for all of us, but he made it seem like it was just me. That was what was so meaningful. Those initial phone calls were just the beginning of a special relationship that Ted forged with the families. The terrorist attacks would become a defining moment in his career, albeit one of the less known chapters in a very public life. He saw this from the very beginning as a huge moment in the country's history, says Mary Beth Cahill, his then chief of staff. He insisted that this become a special task for the office. It became calls to the families on a daily basis. Kennedy had a special kinship with the 9/11 families. Like him, they had experienced shattering personal losses in full public view. Like him, they had to grieve with the eyes of the world upon them. So he cut bureaucratic red tape, but he also performed numerous acts of personal kindness that were not written into the job description of United States Senator. Who knew how much he did for the 9/11 family, says McGinty. Nobody does. He doesn't talk about it. He wanted to protect our privacy, which was at the time being so invaded. And I spoke with one 9/11 widow last November, I think it was, a couple of months ago, who said, I do not know if I would have made it through the past 7 years without Senator Kennedy, literally. Another woman I spoke with, her teenage son had to be hospitalized, and Kennedy found out about it within an hour after the hospitalization somehow, and called her with a list of specialists that he wanted her to, have in her possession in case she needed them. So he seems to have this remarkable attentiveness to people in need and in suffering, exemplified by his response on 9/11.
Yeah, it's not something that you ever hear or read about either. He does it quietly. People should do their good deeds quietly. I think they get extra credit for that. Anyway, I'm going to go back to Joan for a moment, and then we'll move on to Vicki. Joan told me that the happiest times in their marriage for her were during the two campaigns in 1962 and 1964, when it was just us kids, as she put it, and she helped out so much. And Ted, in fact, was in a really terrible airplane crash in 1964, which his pilot was killed along with his one of his chief aides. And Birch Bayh and his wife Marvella were on the plane too, and Birch Bayh pulled the senator out from the wreckage and maybe saved his life. And that was actually right in the middle of Ted's 1964 campaign, so Joan had to step in because Ted was on one of those striker beds for several months, in which he sort of flipped over like a rotisserie, flat on his back, basically. Okay. The arrangement certainly complicated his bid for re-election, but it provided another opportunity for Joan to prove her usefulness. She began gamely filling in for her husband, showing up at campaign events, delivering cute stories and updates on Ted's condition before reading the texts of his speeches. The crowds bathed her in support. White-haired ladies would press religious medallions into her hands and tell her they were praying for Teddy. And the media ate it up. The Boston Globe called her the beauteous blonde, Boston Traveler, blonde vision with a wide Alice in Wonderland look. After her talk, she'd head straight for the hospital to update Ted on what had happened. Mixed in with all the supportive mail were occasional letters of instruction from his mother, who suggested he use the time in the hospital to work on his writing and speaking. Quote, when you're lying in bed, you can read a paragraph and then try to rewrite it or re-say it, Rose read her son. Then notice the difference between succinct, dramatic impressions of the author and your verbose, discursive, dull recital of the same events. I often say that Ted Kennedy was married to two different women, but he was also two different men. The marriages were 35 years apart, and he had evolved, as they say. In the 1960s, he once said that you can't give women too much because they get confused. And he initially was against the ERA and not pro-choice. And so, we know how he's a champion of women's issues now. He met Vicki Reggie in the, 1990 or 1991. She's the daughter of one of the family's close friends, Judge Edmund Reggie, and his wife Doris in Louisiana. They were longtime Kennedy cohorts from the 1950s. So, at this point in his life, Ted had a second bachelorhood in the 1980s, now infamous, various headlines, the Palm Beach rape trial of his nephew, the Georgetown escapades, in the various restaurants. A lot of dating was going on. So at the 40th anniversary party of the Reggies, this is where he meets Vicki, who actually he knew from years earlier. She had been an intern in his office mailroom years earlier. Ted quickly witnessed many of the qualities that made Vicky such an outstanding lawyer. Sharp elbows combined with an even sharper wit. After he rang the doorbell the night of the anniversary party. "What's the matter?" she said, smiling at the senator. "You couldn't get a date?" He followed her into the kitchen while she finished making dinner. They talked for several hours more, mostly just the two of them, more than they had ever had before as the party wore on. A few days later, Kennedy asked her out on a bona fide date. More social than romantic at first, their meetings gradually deepened into a mutual affection that took both by surprise. "Vicky would call and tell me, 'Oh, Mom, we're just friends,' says Doris Reggie. Then one day I sensed a change of tone in her voice. To me, they started out as friends and fell in love." What made Vicky different from the scores of other dates Kennedy had pursued and discarded over the years? She was youthful and attractive, certainly, 5'8", with hazel eyes and a sophisticated air about her. Intelligent, politically savvy, a lover of opera and pro football, an accomplished cook, fluent in French. More significant, perhaps, she was raising 2 young children who were central to her life. For all his middle-aged roistering, Kennedy loved children and never seemed happier than when surrounded by them. Vicky, too, put her children first and was charmed to discover that Ted enthusiastically agreed. One evening at Vicky's house, she apologized for constantly having to dash upstairs to tend to her children, then 8 and 6. "A child calling for its mother is the most beautiful sound in the world," Ted said to her. "Don't ever apologize for that." Unlike Joan and other wives of Kennedy men, Vicky also shared his political interests, enabling her to serve as partner and troubleshooter in all aspects of his life. As her years of negotiating and financial workouts proved, she also had the skills necessary to manage the ebbs and flows of a large group of people with sometimes competing interests, which is what the Kennedy family had become by the early 1990s. Ted had worked desperately hard to keep his extended clan together, but it was becoming harder and harder as divorces, deaths, and scandals were pulling at the fabric of the family. He needed help. After they'd been dating for a few weeks, Vicky later recalled, Ted was stuck on Capitol Hill and could not make it to her house for dinner, where he'd gotten used to helping with the children's homework and reading them bedtime stories. At that moment, she said, I started to realize more and more that this man was very important in my life. To Pamela Covington, a close friend of Vicky's, the couple's affection for Juan was immediately obvious. Well aware of the senator's past reputation, Covington also said she was unconcerned that Vicky would go the way of other Kennedy girlfriends. Edmund Reggie, who had seen plenty of what he calls Kennedy's wild side, was similarly unconcerned. There was no romance before Vicky, none, he asserts, believing that once Ted found the right partner, there would be no more cheating. I knew how strong his religious faith was, and I knew in the end that was going to prevail. Vicky would later be asked about Kennedy's reputation for womanizing and whether it had given her pause. I know him, she responded. I know the tremendous respect he has for me and for his daughters and for his mother. I think that says it all. That Halloween, Ted asked if he could escort Vicky's children as they went trick-or-treating in the Woodley Park area. Neighbors had already taken notice of his frequent comings and goings at Vicky's house. There was no more recognizable person in Washington than Ted Kennedy. Yet even they were startled to see the senator, so in costume, ringing doorbells with 2 small children in tow. The phones ringing up and down the block, Ted appeared on the doorstep of the home belonging to the Chinese cultural attaché. A man answered the doorbell, saw Ted standing there, invited him to sit down, and raced upstairs to tell his boss who would drop by. Vicky and Ted burst out laughing when they heard a voice say, "You stupid fool, that's someone in a Ted Kennedy mask." By November, Ted had decided where he wanted this relationship to go. Relaxing at Vicky's house one evening, the pair was listening to a recording of La Boheme when the senator asked if she would like tickets to an upcoming production at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. She agreed, and one early December day, Kennedy sailed from Hyannisport to Nantucket to pay a call on Edmund and Doris Reggie. "I want to marry Vicky," he announced, "and I want your permission." The Reggies happily said yes. Still, it was not until January that he formally proposed while they were at the Met, and not until a subsequent trip to the Virgin Islands, where the couple stayed with Ted's sister Pat, that Vicky received her diamond and sapphire engagement ring, which Ted had discreetly placed on a piece of coral for Vicky to discover while scuba diving. Say that's in stark contrast to the engagement ring that Joan got, which had been picked out and purchased by Joe, and not seen by Teddy until Joan opened the box. 2 different women, 2 very different husbands.
Okay, fast forward to last summer. Ted endorses Obama at a somewhat crucial juncture in the campaign, shortly before Super Tuesday. I'm going to read you a section about the hurdle they had to overcome to get to that point. Ted felt grateful for Obama's help on the failed 2007 immigration reform legislation, but there was still a sticking point between them. It stemmed from a video that surfaced late in 2007, showing Obama making a disparaging remark about Ted several years earlier. Dick Durbin, Obama's fellow senator from Illinois, had been pressing Kennedy to endorse Obama for president, but one day a clearly miffed Ted took Durbin aside. He was brandishing a newspaper. "I've got to show you this clip," Ted told Durbin. "It's something Barack said about me a few years ago." In June 2003, in an address to AFL-CIO members, Obama, who was then a state senator from Illinois, had contended that the proposed Medicare prescription drug benefit bill did not go far enough in helping seniors. He called on Democrats to get some backbone and vote it down. Then he added, "We've got to call up Ted Kennedy and say, 'Ted, you're getting a little old now, and you've been a fighter for us before. I don't know what's happening now, but get some spine and stand up to Republicans.'" In fact, Ted had turned against the prescription drug benefit for many of the reasons Obama was citing. He was perturbed to learn of Obama's blithe dismissal. "I could tell he was not happy about it," Durbin recalls. Durbin immediately went back to his office and looked up a video clip of Obama's speech. The quote criticizing Kennedy, Durbin noted to his chagrin, was accurate. Disheartened, Durbin called Obama to inform him that Kennedy was upset at Obama's suggestion that he was out of touch and politically pliant. "I didn't say that," Obama exclaimed. Durbin replied, "Barack, it's on the video." So Obama went to Ted to apologize. It was a stupid thing to say, a sheepish Obama told the older senator. Ted accepted his apology and then offered an apology of his own. "Oh, by the way, I'm sorry I called you Osama by mistake," Ted told Obama, referring to a time when he was answering questions at the National Press Club and fumbled for Obama's name, calling him Osama bin Osama Obama. Okay, so we now come to which we all know because it was just a few months ago, the Denver Convention, which there was a lot of suspense about whether Kennedy would be able to make it. Ted Kennedy, old and sick, stood on a stage in Denver on August 25th, 2008, and saw a party that still needed him. He had flown across the country a day earlier, determined to speak on the first night of the convention. By all medical logic, he should not have been anywhere near the Pepsi Center. It was less than 3 months since his surgery. His face was bloated from the anti-seizure medication. His famous mane of white hair was thinner at the crown, the byproduct of chemo and radiation. For a cancer patient, the cross-country flight posed the risk of blood clots, not to mention the chance of brain swelling in the mile-high city, or the possibility he could further compromise his immune system. On top of that, from the moment he arrived in Denver, Ted had been in severe pain. After a sleepless night, he went to the University of Colorado Hospital, where doctors diagnosed kidney stones unrelated to the brain tumor. Just 2 hours before his scheduled time slot for addressing the convention, Ted was still in a hospital bed. All in all, it appeared likely that the only image of him the convention would see would be in the tribute film Ken Burns had prepared. But Ted told Vicki and the doctors that he wanted to speak. A physician and several paramedics accompanied him on the trip to the Pepsi Center, and he was ferried inside on a golf court along with Vicki and Caroline. After Caroline's introduction, Ted walked to the podium to tumultuous applause. Thousands of delegates, many of them far from dry-eyed, waved blue placards with Kennedy in white letters. Obama was squaring off in a presidential election against GOP nominee John McCain, who was saddled with the weight of his ties to the very unpopular President Bush. In theory, Democrats should have been in the highest of spirits. Yet before Ted took the stage, several TV commentators remarked on the strange absence of passion and a coherent message inside the Pepsi Center. If there was anything Ted Kennedy knew how to deliver, it was a passionate message. He accepted a kiss from Vicki, stepped to the lectern, and began to speak. "It is so wonderful to be here," he told the delegates, and gave a little laugh. Nothing was going to keep me away from this special gathering tonight." For the next 7 minutes, Ted proceeded to give the convention a much-needed jolt of adrenaline. In a voice that was sometimes ragged around the edges, but still capable of rhetorical thunder, he spoke with eloquence and urgency. He touched on the groundbreaking nature of Obama's candidacy, touting him as a force for unity, and promising that the nominee would close the book on the old politics of race, gender, and group. Together we have known success and seen setbacks, victory and defeat, Ted told the crowd and the national TV audience. But we've never lost our belief that we are called to a better country and a newer world. And I pledge to you that I will be there next January on the floor of the United States Senate, as indeed he was. For me, this is a season of hope, he added. New hope for justice and prosperity for the many and not just for the few. New hope, and this is the cause of my life, new hope that we will break the old gridlock and guarantee that every American, north, south, east, west, young, old, will have decent quality health care as a fundamental right and not a privilege. We can meet these challenges with Barack Obama. Yes, we can, and finally, yes, we will. If it was a last hurrah, it was a resolutely forward-looking one. Even when language was borrowed from the past, it was pressed into the service of the future. To galvanize the young voters Obama needed to win the presidency, Ted evoked the words that Jack had spoken at his own inauguration in 1960. This November, the torch will be passed again to a new generation of Americans, Ted said. He closed by evoking the words he himself had spoken nearly 3 decades earlier at the 1980 Democratic Convention, saying that the work begins, the hope rises again, and the dream lives on. The final 3 words of his 1980 speech, "Shall never die," were changed to "lives on," suggesting the passage of that symbolic torch. It was a performance of sheer, unstoppable will. Ted lumbered away from the podium to chants of "Teddy, Teddy." There, waiting for him, was Vicky, who had barely left his side in the previous 3 months, and Caroline, his children, and several members of the younger generation of Kennedys to whom he had been such an emotional bulwark. All of them stood waiting for the patriarch. And there were others following his words intently from afar. Cindy McGinty, the 9/11 widow, sat, her eyes filled with tears, and watched Ted's Denver speech from her living room couch. "There's just nothing that keeps that man down," she said to herself. She thought of all that Ted had done for her and her sons, and for many others like them who'd been in need over the previous half-century. There had been an undeniable largeness to his flaws during that time, but there had been an undeniable largeness of spirit, too. As McGinty looked at the TV screen, she saw not a legend, but a friend. Not Kennedy the myth, but Kennedy the man. He's a real person, she says. He's not just a picture in a history book. And now we're going to open up to questions if you have any.
Yes, sir.
Could you say more about how 7 people came to write a coherent book?
Oh, we always get asked this question. We hope it's coherent.
Yeah, I was going to say. We're glad you think so.
Well, we had a great editor, who Peter Canellos, our Washington bureau chief, and because we laid it out pretty much chronologically, that piece was fairly easy and fairly seamless, we hope. There was one part of it that the legislation that Susan Milligan, who's covered him for many years, wrote. It's less chronological. But I mean, I give credit to Peter, but it has to do with 7 voices, 7 egos, 7 different writing styles. And I think if you read the book, as you used to say in 3rd grade, you'll find out the ending. You'll hopefully you won't be able to tell that there's 7 different writers. That's what we're hearing.
What is this ego you speak of, Bella? Oh, please. Yes.
I have read the series in the Globe, and then one of them mentioned today too. When Vicky said that he has respect for his mother, for me, and for his daughters, was he including one of her daughters in that?
Yes, I think so. She must have been.
Yes.
She must have been. He was very close to
That's what I thought.
his stepchildren. basically helped raise them. I guess they were probably 7 and 9 when they got married. Now they're 26 and 22, something like that.
In the back?
Yes, do you know how the family, if not Kennedy himself, has received the book?
We do not know.
No comment.
It was published less than 3 weeks ago. I would guess they're still digesting it. And they have other things on their mind.
Did Senator Kennedy have any comment to you folks about writing about him? I'm curious.
Well, he is writing his own memoir, so he's under contract not to really give away the good stuff. But we did interview people all around him, just about everybody we could, relatives, in-laws, friends, staffers, former staffers, et cetera, et cetera. So we hope we put together as complete a picture.
And many, many senators on both sides of
If
the
he
aisle.
didn't write you a letter and say thanks or please don't.
No.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to the 80s. Phil Donahue had a show, like him or dislike him. There were 4 people on the panel. I do remember one from the Washington Post and one from the New York Times, and it was an hour dedicated to Ted Kennedy. It basically, there was enough material there that the senator gave that it was not complimentary whatsoever. And the reason I remember this so much is my father was involved in town politics where I lived. We were of Irish heritage. We were proud of our Irish heritage. So as I was listening through this whole hour of his demise and his behavior, I was saying, oh, how could you embarrass your own Irish heritage, and what are you doing to Massachusetts? We are literally being laughed at. This is on the whole, everybody is viewing this. It was a whole hour, and it ended by one of the panel, I believe it was the Washington Post, saying, go to Massachusetts, you can get voted in if you're a Kennedy. And being a librarian, I sort of kept an eye on the Washington Post and the New York Times. And a few months later, it seemed that the Kennedy clan, or whoever the camp is, must have been watching Phil Donahue's show. Because all of a sudden, it was like he was hitting the Capitol steps back. Did anybody come across that? And I remember it because being of my origin, my father being in politics, and when I was little town politics, running out, putting up, I was thoroughly embarrassed by it. And it was back in the 80s, and all of a sudden Vicky came in, and I'm going, wow, they're doing a big PR here.
Yeah, there was a lot of that feeling. I mean, well, first of all, Ted gave the tabloids and the talk shows plenty to work with.
Yeah, but did anybody actually see this show? It was
I
an
didn't
hour.
see it, no. I limit my exposure to Phil Donahue.
Well, I mean, like him or not.
Yeah.
I mean, put Phil aside.
Yeah.
He gave him. I mean, the senator gave enough material
Right.
for them to, for an hour, chest
The
up.
Yeah.
80s weren't his finest moment.
No, but there was
personally.
and there was a lot of skepticism when he married Vicky that it was to inoculate him from precisely that perception. But it's proven over time clearly to be a love match, clearly to not be a marriage of convenience, political or otherwise. And I have to say, what's remarkable about Kennedy, well, one of the things is, A, he's never had an unproductive term, whatever the excesses of his personal life. There's never a 7-year period at the end of which people said Ted was kind of dormant. B, the last 15, 16 years, an age at which most people would be shifting into a lower gear, have arguably been among his most productive. So he always had the ability, you know, which we think of Bill Clinton as the great compartmentalizer, but Ted Kennedy was actually before Clinton. Could you know, even when he was partying and out till 3 a.m. and all the rest of it, he was still pushing through legislation at an epic pace. 2,500 major bills, 300 of which became law. I don't think many, if any, senators have done that. And that includes all the years of wretched excess. So it's a remarkable saga. I mean, people have asked about the writing of this book, and I always say it's endlessly fascinating because he is endlessly fascinating, because he's so contradictory. Because, you know, he's not a porcelain saint and not a villain, that there's a rich story to be told there.
I mean, even Republicans will tell you he is the hardest working senator in Washington. Yeah.
Well, along these lines, it would seem that, you know, what you have here is a story of redemption, ultimately. Somebody who, as you say, in the 80s had his peccadillos in public. Do you think it's possible for the American electorate, say, to adopt more tolerant attitudes? You know, we have these candidates for Obama's cabinet who one little flaw and they're out for good. Will we ever come to the point, do you think, of seeing that redemption is possible, or that there may be more to a person than just the one sin or lapse or what have you. I guess that's an
I
impossible
sort of
question.
think the opposite because of the 24/7 news cycle. You used to be able to sort of not cover up, but it would take a while for some of these things to get out. And now with the internet and all the cable channels and the constant newspapers updating the news, it's really hard to keep secrets. It's really hard to keep anything secret. So I think that there's so many more eyes now on these people, public figures, that it's really harder to get away with anything.
And you're describing a different kind of misbehavior, if that's what you want to call it, that gets to the issue of hypocrisy. At a time of austerity, with the economy doing what we all know what it's doing, belt tightening, higher taxes, if these appointees haven't done the basic civic duty of paying their own taxes. That's a different area.
Linda.
Well, yeah, right. I'm intrigued by the word last, so I obviously haven't read the book. Is it referring to the fact that there aren't going to be Ted Kennedys anymore in Congress, or is he the last of the Kennedys, or what's the last?
Well, the last line actually is a quote from John McCain, and this was shortly after the senator was diagnosed. I describe Ted Kennedy as the last line of the Senate. He remains the single most effective member of the Senate if you want to get results. John McCain, May 2008. And we sort of wrestled with the title because The Last Lion was one of the books written by William Manchester on Winston Churchill. But we found out that titles aren't copyrighted, and also we left the "the" off it, so we were covered. But I do think if you think about his nearly 5 decades in the Senate, there are very few who span that time period, for one thing, and you think about the time period he spanned. I mean, from the 50s, the 60s, and all that turmoil, personally and politically, into the new millennium. I just don't see anyone else who comes close to that. I mean, there's a sort of a funny scene in here. But I'm not sure you
Oh yeah, sure.
This is Edmund Reggie, his really close friend and his father-in-law now. This happened probably about a year and a half ago. Well, it was on a warm spring day in 2007. Ted Kennedy and his old friend and father-in-law, Edmund Reggie, sat on the porch in Hyannisport, staring at the view that Ted had enjoyed for 75 years. When showing visitors his home, Ted would sweep his arm out toward the gray churning ocean and express amazement that his view had never changed. Until Cape Wind comes along. It was the only thing in his life that hadn't. And now he too was changing, stooped and old and every bit as fat as Joe Sr. and Rose had feared he would become back in their misses of 7 decades earlier. Skip some of that. Whatever the reason, the hours in church calmed him and kept him going, just like his mother always said they would. But Edmund, who was just 6 years older than Ted, wondered if his friend could ever just sit back, enjoy life, and achieve the kind of peace and acceptance that retirement can bring. "You're nuts to beat yourself to death like this on the Senate floor," Edmund said in the blunt, no-nonsense way in which the two men communicated. "Passing a new law won't be any more glorious for you than the reputation you've made. Some people say you and Daniel Webster are the greatest senators of all time." Ted seemed taken aback, not by the prospect of retirement, but at the suggestion that another senator might have achieved as much as he had. "What did Webster do?" Ted responded in just in tone.
Quite a bit, actually.
So that's part of the answer.
Regarding the research that you all did as a team, what was the most challenging aspect in terms of gathering information or talking with sources or emotions that were in the course of doing it? And you did in quite a short period of time to assemble all of this.
Yeah, emotions is a good word because there was a delicacy to the reporting that would not have existed had we done it a year earlier or 10 years ago, because it was within a month of the senator's diagnosis. So everyone was walking on eggshells. Everyone was still absorbing the shock of the diagnosis, and here comes a team of reporters asking the kind of questions reporters ask. So that was a challenging aspect of it for me. I don't know about Bella.
Yeah, we at first got a lot of no's, and the first question a lot of my sources would ask me, does the senator know you're working on this book? And luckily the answer was yes, because we had been in touch with his office. And so then the next thing that they would do usually is, I'll have to call you back. They'd call the office and say, do you know about this book? I'd say yes. And they'd say, well, should I talk to them? And the answer was, well, that's up to you. So his office was aware that we were working on the project and really didn't put up any roadblocks. But people are very protective of him, naturally.
But I like to think they felt some level of confidence that the Globe would be honest brokers in assessing his legacy. And I think the book bears out, if they had that confidence, I think the book does bear that out.
I had another process question. I was curious if you each worked on, your component, and were there opportunities to sort of come together and reflect on what you were learning, and how did that affect the rest of the work that remained?
Oh, we had a lot of meetings. Peter would come up from Washington. Susan would be she's the congressional correspondent, she'd be on the speakerphone. And we mulled things over. There was a lot of overlap, of course. Neil Swidey, who was the reporter who followed me, he did the 60s basically, he and I interviewed Joan. We shared that transcript with the other reporters so that if they had parts of her interview that would be more relevant to their sections, they used that. So, if someone would come across a source that would be helpful to me, they'd say, here's this name and number, they'll talk to you. And so there was a lot of cooperation, collaboration. And it's interesting because reporters generally tend to be loners, antisocial. So it's, you don't want to share a byline, you don't want to share your notes. But this was a happy collaboration, I think.
Yes.
Is the senator, has he been mentoring any of the next generation? Is there somebody that has because there's so many skills involved now in public service. I mean, you have to be able to speak and, know the law and everything, but is there somebody in the next generation?
There's a young fellow named Obama.
Yeah, that's his.
But I think you mean family?
Yeah, I was thinking family. I mean.
Well, I think whatever lessons he's passed those on. I mean, one of the aspects that I dwell upon in my part of the book is his relentless attempt to connect all the kids, Bobby's kids, Jack, Caroline, and John Jr., all the other cousins, and his own children, with the idea that it's not just a legacy public service, it can also be a destiny. So he takes him to JFK's birthplace in Brookline and to Rose, where Rose was baptized in the North End. And he took him to the, Civil War, every Civil War battlefield. Caroline, we interviewed Caroline, and she told us about him, renting a Winnebago and taking them all over the place. And imparting, when you're a Kennedy, everywhere you go, you're part of the history, so it's an odd feeling. It must be a strange kind of constant looking in the mirror. But anyway, he tried to broaden their sense of themselves. In terms of in the Senate, he did, all joking aside, he did identify Obama early as someone of promise. And once I got that past that little kerfuffle I read about earlier, it's all gone fairly swimmingly from Ted's perspective. Healthcare seems to be very much in the front burner, notwithstanding, the financial crisis. And I don't think there's any accident. I think Kennedy was probably calling from Florida, daily when he was recuperating, saying, don't forget this thing called healthcare. Yes.
Fact or fiction? In the 60s, when LBJ announced that he would not run for re-election, did the Democrat Party approach the senator and ask him to run for president? Approach?
Yeah. Besiege. Yes.
And his reply was, I don't want to be assassinated. What was it?
That was probably in the mix somewhere, but there was several opportunities he had to run. And several times, who knows? 76, post-Watergate, maybe could have won. But I don't know that he ever saw himself. This is kind of, I'm sure all of you, you're all Kennedy watchers being from Massachusetts. Did he ever really want to be president? Was his conception of himself always at bottom that of a senator, that of the next Webster? And, there was always there were always these hands at his back saying, run, Teddy, run. Well, I suspect a lot of you remember the 1980 campaign when he was the most reluctant, incoherent, disorganized presidential run ever. And it really came a cropper in a big way. And after that, he just shelved it, for more or less for good.
We sort of posit in this book that although Jack's and Bobby's personalities may have been more in line with the executive, Teddy's gregariousness Joe often said that he was the best politician in the family. It was more in line with group therapy, group work, negotiating, collegiality. Jack and Bobby were very reluctant campaigners and uncomfortable campaigners, and Teddy's always been a natural in a crowd. He's at his best in a crowd. So, and he has said himself that the Senate is where you get things done, and I think that's where his heart has really always been. I think he was drafted every 4 years, like people living vicariously through him, but not sure his heart was always in it.
Hey, how's Joan doing, and what does she think of Ted at this point in her life?
You know, Joan is a lovely, gracious woman. She's very loyal to the Kennedys, the Kennedy name. She told me that last Thanksgiving was her 50th straight Thanksgiving in Hyannisport. So she always goes. She is the mother and the grandmother of the senator's children and grandchildren, and they have a cordial relationship. And I think she likes still being a Kennedy in name, you know.
She didn't remarry.
She never remarried. She's had a couple of romances, but she never did remarry. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I want to tell you, please support your local independent bookseller and buy a book. Not to mention your authors.
We will happily sign.
I'd like to thank Don and Bella for coming. As I said, we have books. Please buy them. In about 2 weeks, we're going to have another author, Dennis McCullough, my mother, your mother, and we hope you can all show up then too. And thank you very much.